65,000 years ago, a group of human beings crossed open ocean. Not a river, not a strait where you can see the other side. Open ocean, water stretching to the horizon in every direction, with no visible land on the other side, no certainty that land existed on the other side, and no way back if it did not. They crossed it successfully. They reached a continent they had never seen and could not have known was there, and they populated it. This is one of the most extraordinary events in the entire history of our species. It is, by any reasonable standard, one of the most extraordinary events in the history of life on Earth. The first time any terrestrial animal deliberately crossed a significant body of open water and colonized a new landmass. It required boats, or rafts, or some form of watercraft capable of keeping people alive over a crossing of at least 90 kilometers of open sea. It required navigation, some way of maintaining direction across water with no landmarks. It required the courage, or the desperation, or the curiosity to sail toward nothing. Here is what makes this extraordinary event even more extraordinary. It happened 50,000 years before everything we thought we knew about early human technological capability would suggest it should have been possible. The conventional timeline of human behavioral modernity, the emergence of the cognitive and technological sophistication associated with symbolic art, complex tools, long-distance trade, and ocean-going capability, places these developments at roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago in what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Before that threshold, the story goes, early humans were cognitively limited in ways that precluded the planning, cooperation, and technological innovation that ocean crossing requires. After that threshold, the story goes, modern human behavior exploded across the record and the world. The genetic evidence for the first arrival of humans in Australia does not fit this timeline. It places that arrival at approximately 65,000 years ago, roughly 50,000 years before the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, 20 to 25,000 years before the window of time that the standard model would predict any group of humans capable of building watercraft and navigating open water. The crossing happened. The genes of every indigenous Australian alive today are the evidence, and by our best current understanding of when it should have been possible, it was 50,000 years too early. Tonight we are going to explore this mystery from every angle available. We are going to look at what the genetic evidence actually says, and how confident we should be in its dating. We are going to look at the archaeological evidence from Australia that might corroborate or challenge the genetic timeline. We are going to look at what the ocean crossing itself would have required, and whether humans 65,000 years ago could plausibly have accomplished it. We are going to look at what the crossing tells us about the cognitive capabilities of early modern humans, and whether our models of behavioral modernity need to be revised. And we're going to sit with the specific kind of mystery this represents. Not a mystery of absence, but a mystery of presence. The evidence is there. The people arrived. The question is how we explain something that by every model we have should not have happened yet. Before we begin, tell me where you are listening from. And if you are listening from Australia, or if you have any Indigenous Australian heritage, I want you to know that the story we're telling tonight is the story of your deepest ancestors. The people who crossed that ocean 65,000 years ago are, in the most direct biological sense, the founders of the world's oldest continuous cultural tradition. Whatever questions remain about the how, that is not in doubt. Drop your city in the comments. Let us begin. To understand why the Australian crossing is so remarkable, you first have to understand what it actually required. This is not a question with a comfortable answer, because the more carefully you look at the logistics, the more impressive the achievement becomes. The geography of the route is the starting point. During the last ice age, when sea levels were substantially lower than today, perhaps 60 to 120 metres lower, depending on the specific period, the relationship between the land masses of Southeast Asia and Australia was different from what it is today. Indonesia, which is today an archipelago of thousands of islands, was substantially consolidated into a larger landmass called Sunda, connected to the Asian mainland. Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania were joined into a single large landmass called Sahul. But between Sunda and Sahul, even at the lower sea levels of the Ice Age, there was always open water. The channel between them, which oceanographers and archaeologists call Wallacea after the 19th century naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who first described the biogeographic boundary it creates, was never bridged by dry land. This is important. The Ice Age did not create a land bridge to Australia. The crossing always required water travel. Estimates of the minimum distance that would have needed to be crossed at the most favourable sea levels of the relevant period range from approximately 90 to 150 kilometres, a crossing long enough that land on the other side would not have been visible from land on the starting side, even on the clearest day, even from the highest available elevation. This is not a river crossing. It is not a straight crossing. It is an open ocean voyage of at least 90 kilometres, probably more, into complete uncertainty. The minimum technological requirement for such a crossing is some form of watercraft capable of keeping multiple people alive for the duration of the passage. Multiple people, because a crossing by a single individual would almost certainly not produce the founding population that genetic analysis tells us colonize Sahul. The founding population of Australia, estimated from the genetic diversity of contemporary Indigenous Australians, was probably at least several hundred individuals, which implies not a single boat making a single crossing, but either multiple crossings, or a single crossing by a substantial group requiring multiple large vessels working together. The navigational requirement is equally demanding. A crossing of 90 or more kilometres of open ocean, out of sight of land on both the departure and arrival sides, requires some method of maintaining direction across the water. In the absence of land-based reference points, navigation depends on the sky, on the position of the sun during the day, the stars at night, and possibly on the direction of prevailing winds and ocean swells, which experienced ocean people can read as directional signals even in the absence of celestial guidance. None of these methods are simple. All of them require practice, accumulated knowledge, and the transmission of that knowledge across generations, cultural technology that takes time and sustained effort to develop. The provisioning requirement is also significant. A crossing of at least 90 kilometres, even in favourable conditions, would take multiple days. The people crossing needed water, the most critical survival requirement, harder to provision for than food, and food sufficient for the journey. This implies not just boats, but prepared boats, stocked boats, boats prepared for a specific journey, rather than improvised craft hastily assembled at the shore. Every element of this picture, the multi-vessel fleet, the open ocean navigation, the provisioning and preparation, implies a level of planning, coordination, and accumulated technical knowledge that our models of early human cognitive capability have traditionally placed well after 65,000 years ago. And yet the people were there. The logistical challenge becomes even clearer when you consider the specific geography more carefully. The Wallaceian crossing was not a single leap across open water. It was a series of island-to-island crossings, each one extending the range of the voyagers further from the familiar landmass of Sunda and further into the open ocean. The route would have taken the crossing groups through a sequence of islands: Bali, Lombok, Sumbawa, Flores, Timor, perhaps with branches through Sulawesi and the Moluccas, before reaching the final and longest open water crossing to Sahul itself. Each island-to-island crossing along this route presented its own challenges, but the intermediate islands also provided something crucial: stopping points where provisions could be replenished, where the crossing group could rest and repair their vessels, and where knowledge of the next leg of the journey could be accumulated through observation and perhaps through contact with earlier voyagers who had made the same route. The stepping-stone nature of the Wallaceian crossing route made it physically more achievable than a single direct ocean crossing of equivalent total distance would have been. The island of Timor is particularly interesting in this context. At the lowest sea levels of the relevant glacial period, Timor extended further towards Sahul than it does today, reducing the final open water gap to Sahul to somewhere between 60 and 90 kilometres. This is still a substantial open ocean crossing, substantial enough to require genuine navigational capability and seaworthy vessels, but it is at the lower end of what the crossing required, and it places the final leap within the range that experienced maritime people could plausibly achieve with the technology available. The seasonal timing of the crossing would also have been critical. The winds and currents of the Timor Sea are strongly seasonal. During the northwest monsoon season, which runs roughly from November to March, winds blow consistently from the northwest toward the southeast, which is the direction of Sahul from Timor. A crossing group that timed their departure to take advantage of the monsoon would have had the wind at their backs for the most challenging section of the voyage. The maritime people of island Southeast Asia have historically exploited these seasonal wind patterns for long-distance voyaging. It is a basic feature of seamanship in this part of the world that anyone regularly working with boats in this environment would likely have understood. The primary evidence for the 65,000-year arrival date comes from genetics, specifically from the analysis of the genomes of contemporary Indigenous Australians and their relationship to the broader patterns of human genetic diversity and dispersal. The foundational framework is the out-of-Africa model of modern human dispersal. Modern Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, and the ancestors of all non-African populations today derive from a dispersal out of Africa that began sometime in the period between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago. The genetic evidence for this dispersal is robust and well replicated. Non-African populations around the world show a characteristic reduction in genetic diversity compared to African populations, consistent with the bottleneck that would be expected when a small founding group left Africa and their descendants colonized the rest of the world. Within the non-African world, Australian Aboriginal populations occupy a distinctive position. They show the greatest divergence from other non-African populations of any living human group, which is consistent with their ancestors having been among the first populations to leave the African to Asian dispersal corridor and branch off into a separate founding lineage. The depth of this divergence, measured by the accumulation of genetic differences through normal mutation rates over time, places the separation of the Australian founding lineage from other non-African populations at approximately 58,000 to 72,000 years ago, with a midpoint estimate of around 65,000 years ago. This estimate comes from multiple lines of genomic analysis, applied by independent research groups using different methodologies, and they converge on the same general range. A landmark study published in Nature in 2016 by a team led by Eske Villerslev at the University of Copenhagen analysed 83 Aboriginal Australian and 25 Papuan genomes and concluded that their ancestors arrived in Sahul approximately 58,000 years ago. A subsequent study by a different team, using slightly different methodological assumptions, placed the arrival at approximately 65,000 years ago. The studies do not perfectly agree on the specific date, but they agree that the arrival predates the conventional Upper Paleolithic threshold of 50,000 years ago by a substantial margin. There is an important caveat about genetic dating that is worth understanding. Molecular clocks, the use of mutation accumulation rates to estimate the time since two populations diverged, are not perfectly precise instruments. They depend on assumptions about mutation rates, generation times, and population sizes that introduce uncertainty into the estimates. The uncertainty range on the Australian arrival date, accounting for these methodological factors, is roughly plus or minus 10,000 years on either side of the central estimate. So the 65,000-year figure should be understood as the centre of a range that extends from roughly 55,000 to 75,000 years ago. Even at the lower end of this range, 55,000 years ago, the arrival predates the 50,000-year threshold of the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. At the upper end of the range, it predates that threshold by 25,000 years. In either case, the crossing appears to have happened earlier than the standard model of behavioural modernity would predict. The question is not whether the genetic evidence places the arrival before the behavioural modernity threshold. It does. The question is how much before. A key piece of evidence for the early arrival comes from the genome of a young man whose remains were found in Mungo in western New South Wales, dating to approximately 42,000 years ago. The Mungo man genome, partially recovered from degraded ancient DNA, in what was one of the most technically challenging ancient DNA extractions ever attempted, shows clear continuity with contemporary Aboriginal Australian populations, which places the founding lineage of Australian populations firmly in the pre-50,000-year window and rules out the possibility that the genetic divergence dates reflect a later arrival that the genomic analysis had mistakenly pushed back in time. Genetics tells us when people arrived. Archaeology tells us what they did when they got there. And the archaeological record of early Australia adds both corroborating evidence and additional complexity to the genetic picture. The most significant recent development in Australian archaeological dating was the publication in 2017 of results from Madjedbebe, a rock shelter in the Northern Territory of Australia that is one of the oldest known archaeological sites on the continent. The Madjedbebe site had been excavated previously, with earlier dates suggesting occupation going back to around 50,000 years ago. The 2017 study, led by Chris Clarkson at the University of Queensland and using improved optically stimulated luminescence dating techniques on sand grains from the occupation layers, produced dates for the earliest occupation layer of approximately 65,000 years ago, precisely matching the genetic estimate. The artifacts from the 65,000-year-old layer at Madjedbebe are themselves remarkable. They include ground-edge axes, a stone tool technology previously thought to have been developed in Australia only around 35,000 years ago, and not to have appeared anywhere else in the world until about 10,000 years ago. They include ochre processing equipment, grinding stones stained with red and yellow ochre, suggesting the preparation of pigments almost certainly used for body decoration, or possibly for making marks on surfaces. They include reflective pieces of mica that may have been used for decoration. The technological and behavioural sophistication of the Madjedbebe assemblage, at 65,000 years ago, substantially exceeds what the standard model would predict for a human population at that time. The Madjedbebe dates have been contested. A critique published shortly after the 2017 paper argued that the OSL dates might be unreliable due to bioturbation, the mixing of sediment layers by burrowing animals or root growth, which could have introduced older sand grains into younger layers, making the occupation appear older than it actually was. The original research team responded to this critique, defending their dating methodology and arguing that the evidence for bioturbation was not sufficient to invalidate the dates. The debate has not been fully resolved in the archaeological literature, and the Madjedbebe dates remain technically contested even as they continue to be widely cited. Other archaeological evidence from Australia supports occupation considerably older than 50,000 years, even if the specific 65,000-year date from Madjedbebe remains debated. Sites across the continent show occupation dates in the range of 45,000 to 55,000 years ago from multiple dating methods, including OSL, thermoluminescence, and uranium series dating of associated materials. The convergence of dates across independent sites and independent dating methods provides substantial confidence that humans were in Australia well before 50,000 years ago, even if the precise date of first arrival remains uncertain. One of the most striking features of the early Australian archaeological record is its geographic spread. Sites dated to the period between 45,000 and 65,000 years ago are distributed across a large portion of the continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from the coasts to the interior. This geographic spread implies a founding population that dispersed rapidly and widely across the continent after arrival, consistent with the genetic evidence for a substantial founding group rather than a handful of individuals, and inconsistent with a scenario in which the dates from individual sites reflect occasional chance arrivals rather than a sustained founding colonisation. The reason the Australian crossing is such a significant intellectual challenge is that it forces a confrontation with one of the most fundamental narratives in the study of human evolution, the narrative of behavioural modernity and when it emerged. The concept of behavioural modernity refers to the cluster of cognitive and cultural capabilities that distinguish modern human behaviour from the behaviour of earlier hominin species, and arguably from the behaviour of anatomically modern humans before a certain threshold. The capabilities in question include the use of symbolic representation, art, decoration, marking of objects with non-utilitarian meaning, the production of composite tools made from multiple components requiring planning and sequencing, long-distance exchange of materials, and presumably information across social networks extending beyond the local group. The use of language complex enough to support the transmission of cumulative cultural knowledge across generations, and the capacity for the kind of abstract counterfactual thinking that allows for planning of complex future actions. The traditional model placed the emergence of behavioural modernity at approximately 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, coinciding with the appearance of the Upper Paleolithic industries in Europe. The blade tools, the cave paintings, the figurines, the personal ornaments that define the archaeological record of anatomically modern humans after their arrival in Europe. This model, developed primarily by archaeologists working in Europe, treated the European Upper Paleolithic as the canonical expression of behavioural modernity and dated the cognitive revolution it represented to the period just before or coinciding with the colonisation of Europe by modern humans. The problem with this model, which has become increasingly apparent over the last 20 years of research, is that its geographic and temporal centre of gravity is wrong. The symbolic behaviours and technological innovations that define behavioural modernity were not invented in Europe at 40,000 years ago. They were already present in Africa tens of thousands of years earlier. The Blombos cave site in South Africa has produced evidence of ochre processing and symbolic engraving on ochre plaques dating to approximately 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. Shell beads from North Africa and the Levant dated to 130,000 years ago are among the oldest known personal ornaments anywhere in the world. The Pinnacle Point cave site in South Africa has produced evidence of heat-treated silkrete tools, a technologically sophisticated process requiring planning and delayed gratification, dating to approximately 165,000 years ago. The picture that emerges from this African evidence is not of a sudden cognitive revolution at 50,000 years ago, but of a mosaic of behavioural innovations appearing and disappearing across Africa over a period of hundreds of thousands of years, with different capabilities appearing in different places and at different times, sometimes persisting and sometimes not, gradually consolidating into the consistent package of behavioural modernity that characterises all modern human populations by the time of the out-of-Africa dispersal. The cognitive revolution was not an event, it was a process, and it was largely complete, or at least substantially advanced, before the populations that would eventually reach Australia left Africa. This revised understanding of behavioural modernity makes the Australian crossing slightly less paradoxical than it initially appears. If the ancestors of Australian Aboriginals were carrying a cognitive toolkit that included symbolic behaviour, technological innovation, and the capacity for complex planning and social coordination at least 65,000 years ago, as the African evidence suggests was possible, then the ocean crossing, while still extraordinary, is not necessarily requiring capabilities that were unavailable at the time. It is requiring the application of available capabilities to a specific and extremely demanding challenge. The capabilities may have been there. What was required was the opportunity, the motivation, and the specific accumulated knowledge that ocean crossing demands. The implications of the revised behavioural modernity timeline extend beyond the specific question of the Australian crossing. They force a rethinking of the entire narrative of what early modern humans were doing between 200,000 years ago, when the first anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record, and 50,000 years ago, when the conventional model places the cognitive revolution. Under the traditional model, those 150,000 years were largely a period of cognitive stagnation, anatomically modern humans present but behaviourally pre-modern, not yet in possession of the full cognitive toolkit that would eventually make them the dominant species on Earth. Under the revised model, those 150,000 years were a period of gradual cognitive and cultural development, with different capabilities appearing in different populations at different times, accumulating and spreading and eventually consolidating into the full modern behavioural package. The archaeological record that supports this revised picture is growing rapidly as researchers look more carefully and with better tools at the Middle Stone Age of Africa and the Middle Paleolithic of the Levant and other regions. Sites like Blombos Cave and Pinnacle Point in South Africa, School and Kafze in Israel, Jebel Ehud in Morocco, all of these have produced evidence of symbolic behaviour, sophisticated technology, and complex social organisation at dates well before 50,000 years ago. The picture they paint collectively is of a modern human species that was already doing many of the things we associate with behavioural modernity tens of thousands of years before the Upper Paleolithic revolution, but doing them sporadically, in specific populations and specific environmental contexts, without the consistent ubiquity that the Upper Paleolithic record shows. What changed at 50,000 years ago may not have been cognitive capability. What changed may have been demographic and environmental conditions, the specific configuration of population sizes, climate and opportunity that allowed the behavioural toolkit that had been developing for 150,000 years to spread and consolidate across all modern human populations and become the universal human baseline. The Australian crossing, on this view, was not accomplished by humans who had just recently acquired new cognitive capabilities. It was accomplished by humans who had been cognitively capable of it for a long time and finally encountered the specific circumstances, the geography, the climate, the accumulated maritime knowledge, the demographic pressure or curiosity that brought those capabilities to bear on that specific challenge. The specific cognitive capability that the Australian crossing most directly demonstrates is what researchers sometimes call prospective cognition. the ability to plan for future events and contingencies that have not yet occurred, to imagine a scenario that does not yet exist, and take actions in the present to prepare for it. Building a vessel for a specific crossing, stocking it with provisions calculated for the expected duration of the voyage, gathering the knowledge needed to navigate a route you have never travelled. All of these require the ability to project oneself mentally into a future that exists only as an imagined possibility. This is a profound cognitive capability, and the Australian crossing demonstrates that it was present and functional in humans 65,000 years ago. The watercraft question is the most practically vexing aspect of the Australian crossing, and it is one that the evidence cannot directly answer, because wooden or bamboo watercraft do not survive 65,000 years in the archaeological record. We have no boats from the crossing. We will never have boats from the crossing. What we have is the negative evidence that people arrived, from which we are forced to infer the technology that must have carried them. The inference is not entirely unconstrained. The geography of the Wallacean crossing route and the specific distances and conditions that the crossing would have entailed allows us to reason about what minimum watercraft capability would have been required and whether that capability is plausible for humans of the relevant period. The most important constraint is the minimum crossing distance. Even at the lowest sea levels of the relevant period, the Wallacea crossing required at least 90 kilometres of open ocean travel, and probably substantially more. A crossing of this distance in the open ocean, subject to wind and current, requires a vessel that is stable enough to remain upright in moderate swells, large enough to carry multiple people with provisions for several days, and sufficiently manoeuvrable to maintain a general direction against crosswinds and currents. These are not trivial requirements. The simplest vessel that might plausibly meet these requirements is a large bamboo raft. Bamboo is extraordinarily buoyant. It is hollow, and the gas within the culms provides significant flotation, and it is abundant throughout the tropical and subtropical regions of Southeast Asia that the crossing route passed through. Bamboo rafts can be made without metal tools, using only stone tools and plant fibre lashings, and can be made large enough to carry multiple people and substantial provisions. The construction requires no technological knowledge that could not plausibly have been available to humans in the relevant period. The navigation question is harder. A bamboo raft crossing 90 kilometres or more of open ocean without the ability to maintain direction would almost certainly fail. The raft would be carried by wind and current away from the intended destination, and without a way to correct for drift, the crossing would become an uncontrolled voyage with an uncertain outcome. The evidence that people actually arrived, that they actually hit the Sahul landmass across a broad enough front to establish a founding population, implies successful directed navigation, not lucky drift. The celestial navigation capabilities available to early modern humans are not directly attested in the archaeological record, but there is no reason to think they were unavailable. The patterns of stars in the night sky, the path of the sun across the day sky, and the dominant wind and swell patterns of the tropical ocean crossing route are all knowable through observation and experience, requiring no technology beyond the human sensory and cognitive apparatus. Indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific and Indian Ocean have historically demonstrated extraordinary navigational capabilities using exactly these tools: star paths, sun angles, wave patterns, bird behaviour, cloud formations over distant land. There is no reason to think the ancestors of contemporary Aboriginal Australians lacked the observational intelligence and accumulated knowledge that these navigation methods require. What the watercraft question ultimately comes down to is whether there is any reason to think humans 65,000 years ago could not have built a bamboo raft capable of crossing 90 kilometres of open ocean. The answer, when you examine the specific requirements carefully, is that there is no compelling reason to think they could not. The materials were available. The cognitive capability for planning and construction was available. The navigational knowledge was achievable through observation and transmission. What the crossing required was not advanced technology in any absolute sense. It required the application of available cognitive and material resources to a specific and demanding challenge. Given that the challenge was met, given that the people arrived, the conclusion that the technology required was within reach of the humans of the time is not a radical inference. It is the straightforward implication of what happened. The bamboo raft hypothesis deserves more detailed treatment because the specific properties of bamboo make it a genuinely plausible construction material for a vessel capable of the Wallacean crossing. Bamboo culms, the individual hollow stems of the bamboo plant, have a density significantly lower than water, making them highly buoyant. A raft constructed of multiple bamboo culms lashed together would sit high in the water and would be remarkably resistant to swamping, the primary danger for a low freeboard vessel in open ocean conditions. The lashing materials available in tropical Southeast Asia, including plant fibre rope and rattan, are strong enough to hold a bamboo raft together under the stresses of moderate ocean swells. The tools required to harvest and process bamboo, stone axes, stone knives, the ground-edge axes found at the 65,000-year level at Madjedbebe, are exactly the tools that were available to the crossing population. A large bamboo raft, say 10 to 15 metres in length with a beam of 3 to 5 metres, constructed from several dozen large bamboo culms, would be capable of carrying 10 to 20 people plus provisions of food and fresh water for a crossing of several days. It would be stable enough in moderate ocean swells to be survivable, though not comfortable. It would not be fast. Bamboo rafts are notoriously slow compared to canoes or other hulled vessels. But speed is not the primary requirement for a crossing of this type. Survivability is, and a well-constructed bamboo raft provides survivability that is more than adequate for the minimum requirements of the crossing. The freshwater provisioning is the most critical practical challenge. Human beings require approximately 2 to 3 litres of water per day to remain functional in tropical conditions. A crossing of 90 kilometres in a bamboo raft, at typical raft speeds of perhaps 2 to 3 kilometres per hour, under favourable wind conditions, would take approximately 30 to 45 hours of sailing time. But ocean crossings are not made at constant speed, and the effects of contrary wind, current, and the need to rest would extend the actual crossing time substantially. A realistic estimate for the duration of the Timor Sea crossing is somewhere between 3 and 7 days. At 3 litres per person per day, a group of 20 people would require 180 to 420 litres of fresh water, a substantial provisioning challenge requiring pre-prepared water containers of some kind. Bamboo culms themselves are sealed at each node and can hold water. A large bamboo culm can hold several litres in its hollow interior. A raft made of dozens of bamboo culms could potentially double as its own water storage system, with specific culms filled with fresh water before departure. Whether the crossers thought of or used this specific solution is unknown, but it illustrates how the same material that provided flotation might also have provided water storage, a functional elegance that would be characteristic of the kind of integrated, problem-solving approach to materials that behaviourally modern humans demonstrate. One of the questions that the archaeological and genetic evidence cannot answer directly, but that any full account of the Australian crossing must address, is why. Why did people make this crossing? What motivated a group of human beings to load into boats or onto rafts, point themselves at a horizon with no visible land beyond it, and sail into the unknown? Several frameworks have been proposed for thinking about this question, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is straightforward demographic pressure. Human populations in Southeast Asia 65,000 years ago were small but growing, and the resource base in any given area has limits. A population that has filled its available territory to the capacity of its subsistence technology has motivation to explore new territories, and the ocean was the edge of the known world. If there was land beyond the sea, and at 65,000 years ago, the people of Sunda may have had no way of knowing whether there was or not, that land would have been valuable. The motivation to explore, driven by population pressure or by the basic human drive toward new territory and new resources, is a plausible explanation that requires no special assumptions. The second framework involves the specific environmental conditions of the period. The climate of Southeast Asia and Wallacea 65,000 years ago was different from today, and possibly different in ways that made the crossing route more visible and more navigable than it would be today. Lower sea levels changed the geography of the islands, making some stepping stone islands larger and bringing them closer to each other and to Sahul. Different wind and current patterns in the ocean, possible during the different climate regime of the glacial period, might have made the crossing physically easier in specific seasonal windows. The environmental conditions may have opened a window of opportunity, making the crossing achievable at a specific time in a way that it would not have been achievable at other times. The third framework is accident, or more precisely survival from accident. A group of people on a large fishing raft carried by storm or current beyond their normal range could find themselves in open ocean with no way back and no choice but to continue. Survival motivation in this scenario is absolute. The people on the raft had no alternative but to keep going in the direction that seemed most promising and hope that land existed in that direction. Several of the prehistoric colonizations of Pacific islands are thought to have begun with exactly this kind of accidental dispersal. The voyagers did not necessarily intend to colonize a new island. They survived and adapted. This last scenario is interesting because it removes the need to explain the crossing as a planned technological achievement and repositions it as a survival event. The people who reached Sahul may not have been trying to reach Sahul. They may have been trying to survive. The cognitive and technological capability required for an accidental survival crossing is substantially lower than the capability required for a planned colonization voyage. You need to be able to build a raft capable of sustaining people for the duration of an unplanned long voyage, which people who routinely fished offshore would plausibly have been able to do, and you need the survival skills and psychological resilience to continue when the outcome is uncertain. The founding population genetics do complicate the purely accidental scenario somewhat. The population size estimates from genetic analysis suggest that the founding group was large enough that a single accidental crossing by a small group is unlikely to account for the full founding population. Multiple crossings, or a large group on multiple vessels, seems more consistent with the genetic evidence. This pushes back towards some level of deliberate repeated effort, not necessarily a systematic organized colonization program, but at minimum a pattern of crossings that over time brought a large enough founding population to Sahul to produce the genetic diversity we observe in contemporary Aboriginal Australians. When the first humans arrived in Sahul 65,000 years ago, they arrived in a world that no human being had ever seen. Not just a new landmass, but a biologically novel world, a continent that had been evolving in isolation from the rest of the world for tens of millions of years, producing a fauna of extraordinary diversity and strangeness. Australia at 65,000 years ago was home to a suite of megafauna, large-bodied animals, many of them now extinct. That would have been unlike anything the arriving humans had encountered in Africa or Southeast Asia. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial ever to have lived, was approximately the size of a hippopotamus. Procoptodon gallia was a giant short-faced kangaroo standing approximately 2 to 3 meters tall and weighing up to 230 kilograms. Thylacaleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, was a powerful predator with extraordinarily strong forelimbs and blade-like teeth. Megalania, a giant monitor lizard reaching up to 7 meters in length, was the largest land lizard in Earth's history. Giant wombats, giant echidnas, enormous flightless birds. The megafauna of Pleistocene Australia was a world unto itself. Most of these animals went extinct shortly after the arrival of humans. The timing of the megafauna extinctions in Australia and the cause of those extinctions has been one of the most contentious debates in quaternary science for decades. Two competing hypotheses have dominated the discussion. The overkill hypothesis, most associated with the American ecologist Paul Martin, proposes that the megafauna went extinct primarily because human hunters, arriving in a landscape where the animals had no experience of human predation and therefore no fear response, were able to hunt them to extinction in a relatively short period. The climate hypothesis proposes that the megafauna were already in decline due to the climate changes of the Pleistocene, and that human arrival was either coincidental or at most a contributing factor in an extinction process already underway. The timing of the extinctions, where it can be established with sufficient precision, tends to correlate with human arrival rather than with specific climate events, which is suggestive of the overkill hypothesis. But the Australian megafauna had survived multiple previous climate cycles without going extinct, which argues against pure climate causation and strengthens the case for human involvement. The current consensus in the field leans toward a combination of factors: human hunting pressure, habitat modification through the use of fire, and climate change interacting in a synergistic way that was more damaging to the megafauna than any single factor alone. What is most relevant to the story of the crossing is what the megafauna extinction implies about the capabilities and behaviour of the first Australians. A human population capable of contributing to the extinction of a suite of large, diverse, unfamiliar animals within a few thousand years of arrival is a human population with effective hunting technology. The cognitive flexibility to adapt hunting strategies to unfamiliar prey, and the demographic growth rate to expand across a continent rapidly enough to put consistent pressure on animal populations across a wide geographic range. These are not the capabilities of a cognitively limited, technologically primitive population. They are the capabilities of the behaviourally modern humans that the conventional model would not predict to exist at 65,000 years ago. The story of the Australian crossing has been complicated further, in recent years, by the discovery of Denisovan DNA in the genomes of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, a finding that adds another layer to the picture of who the first Australians were and where they came from. Denisovans were a population of archaic humans, closely related to Neanderthals, known primarily from a handful of bone and tooth fragments found in the Denisova cave in Siberia. The Denisovan genome was sequenced from a finger bone and a few teeth, providing a genetic profile of a population that has otherwise left almost no physical trace in the archaeological record. The sequencing revealed that Denisovans were genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans, that they interbred with modern humans at some point, and that their genetic legacy persists today in specific populations. The most significant Denisovan signal in living humans is found in Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, who carry approximately 3 to 6% Denisovan-derived DNA, substantially more than the 1 to 2% found in most other non-African populations. This elevated Denisovan contribution in Australian and Papuan populations implies that the ancestors of these populations encountered and interbred with Denisovans at some point along the route from Africa to Sahul. The timing and location of this encounter is not precisely known, but the geographic and genetic evidence suggests it occurred somewhere in Southeast Asia or the Wallacean archipelago in the period before or during the crossing. The Denisovan discovery raises questions about what the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were actually doing in the period immediately before the crossing. If they were interbreeding with Denisovans, a population that had been in Southeast Asia for a very long time, and had presumably developed adaptations to the local environment over that extended period, the modern human Denisovan admixture may have introduced genetic variants that aided the founders of the Australian population in the specific challenges of island Southeast Asia and the tropical environment of Sahul. Some of the immune variants associated with Denisovan ancestry in Melanesian populations appear to be specifically adapted to the pathogen environment of Southeast Asia. The admixture event may not have been neutral. More broadly, the Denisovan complication suggests that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were part of a complex multi-species human landscape in Southeast Asia at the time of the crossing, a landscape that included at least 2 archaic human populations in addition to the modern humans who would eventually reach Sahul. What interactions occurred among these populations beyond the interbreeding that the genetic evidence documents is unknown, but the picture is of a more complex and more interconnected ancient human world than the simple narrative of modern humans replacing archaic populations might suggest. The Australian crossing, and the behavioural sophistication it implies in humans at 65,000 years ago, has broader implications that extend well beyond the specific question of when people arrived in Australia. It is part of a growing body of evidence that is forcing a fundamental revision of our understanding of when and how modern human cognitive capabilities emerged. The traditional model, the Upper Paleolithic revolution at 50,000 years ago, the sudden explosion of symbolic and technological complexity, has been challenged from multiple directions. The African evidence for early symbolic behaviour, discussed earlier, pushes the origins of behavioural modernity back to at least 100,000 years ago, and possibly to 200,000 years ago. The Australian crossing pushes the evidence for open ocean navigation back to 65,000 years ago. The discovery of sophisticated ochre processing at Blombos Cave, the discovery of heat-treated silkrete tools at Pinnacle Point, the evidence for complex composite tools in the Middle Stone Age of Africa, all of these findings point toward a picture in which modern cognitive capabilities were not acquired suddenly at 50,000 years ago, but were present in varying degrees and combinations across a much longer period. The revised picture that is emerging from this evidence is one of cognitive gradualism rather than cognitive revolution. Modern human intelligence was not switched on at a particular moment. It accumulated through the normal processes of genetic and cultural evolution over hundreds of thousands of years, with different capabilities appearing in different populations at different times, and gradually spreading and consolidating into the consistent behavioural package that all modern human populations carry today. The 50,000-year threshold is not when humans became cognitively modern. It is when the archaeological record, for reasons that have as much to do with preservation and sampling bias as with what was actually happening, became rich enough to make behavioural modernity clearly visible. The Australian crossing fits naturally into this revised picture, a population carrying the accumulated cognitive toolkit of hundreds of thousands of years of African and Asian evolution, with behavioural modernity already substantially present in their cultural repertoire, encountered a specific challenge, a major ocean crossing, and met it. The meeting of that challenge was not a sign that they had recently acquired new cognitive capabilities. It was a sign that the capabilities they had long carried were being applied to a new and unprecedented situation. The crossing was not the beginning of human behavioural modernity. It was an expression of a behavioural modernity that had been developing for a very long time. The specific evidence from Australia contributes to this revised picture in several ways beyond the simple fact of the early arrival date. The technological assemblage from the earliest levels at Madjedbebe is particularly revealing. Ground edge axes, stone tools in which the cutting edge has been shaped by grinding rather than by flaking, are present at 65,000 years ago in Australia, making Australian ground edge axes by far the oldest known examples of this tool type anywhere in the world. Ground edge axes appear in Europe and the Near East only around 10,000 years ago, in the Neolithic. They appear in Australia 55,000 years earlier. This is not because Australian toolmakers were uniquely inventive. It is because the environments, materials and tasks that Australian toolmakers faced created specific technological needs that ground edge axes addressed particularly well. Needs related to working with the specific wood and plant fibre resources of tropical and subtropical Australia in ways that flaked stone tools could not do as effectively. The ground edge axe is a technology developed in response to specific environmental and practical demands, and the people who developed it were cognitively capable of developing it because they were fully modern humans with fully modern cognitive capabilities. The ochre evidence from Madjedbebe is equally significant. The presence of ochre processing equipment, grinding stones stained with red and yellow ochre, indicating the systematic preparation of mineral pigments, at 65,000 years ago implies the use of pigments for body decoration, ritual practice, or art production. Its presence in the Madjedbebe assemblage at 65,000 years ago is consistent with a population already engaging in the symbolic and ritual behaviours that define behavioural modernity in the African record. These technological signatures from the earliest Australian occupation converge with the genetic evidence and the dating evidence to paint a consistent picture of a population that was not behaviourally limited or cognitively pre-modern at 65,000 years ago. They were the full article, modern humans in every sense that matters, bringing with them the cognitive toolkit and the accumulated cultural knowledge that their deep African and Asian ancestry had provided. The ocean crossing was not their first impressive achievement. It was the latest in a long series of achievements by a species that had been impressive for a very long time. The implications for the standard model extend how we think about the relationship between biological evolution and cultural evolution in the development of modern human behaviour. The traditional model implied a relatively tight coupling between the two. The behavioural modernity emerged when biological evolution produced the specific neural changes that made complex symbolic cognition possible, and that those changes occurred at a specific historical moment. The revised model implied by the Australian evidence suggests a looser coupling, that the biological substrate for behavioural modernity was in place long before the behavioural toolkit was fully assembled, and that the assembly of the toolkit was driven primarily by cultural and demographic processes rather than by ongoing biological evolution. The brain that crossed to Australia 65,000 years ago was, in all essential respects, the same brain that we have today. One of the most profound and least appreciated aspects of the Australian story is what happened after the crossing, the 65,000 years of cultural continuity that connects the founding population to the contemporary Aboriginal Australian communities whose ancestors they are. 65,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time from the perspective of recorded human history. The oldest written records are approximately 5,000 years old. The earliest known cities are approximately 10,000 years old. The agricultural revolution that preceded those cities was approximately 12,000 years ago. The entire span of recorded human civilization, all of it from the first clay tablets in Mesopotamia to the present moment, fits into the last 7.5% of the time that Aboriginal Australians and their ancestors have been living in Australia. During those 65,000 years, the Aboriginal Australian cultural tradition maintained a continuity that is without parallel in the human world. Languages descended from the founding population's languages are still spoken today. Oral traditions connecting living Aboriginal Australians to the Dreamtime, the foundational cosmological framework of Aboriginal belief, incorporate geological and environmental events that can be independently verified from the scientific record, including descriptions of sea level rise and the flooding of coastlines that matches the post-glacial sea level rise that occurred between approximately 20,000 and 7,000 years ago. The oral tradition preserved accurate geographical and environmental information across an interval of up to 10,000 years, transmitted through generations by spoken word, a feat of cultural memory with no known parallel in any other human tradition. The rock art of Australia, the oldest continuous artistic tradition on Earth, records something of what Aboriginal Australian cultures produced and valued across that extraordinary span. The oldest securely dated Australian rock art is approximately 28,000 years ago, but the tradition almost certainly extends further back, to materials that have not survived. The art spans an enormous range of subjects and styles, from the dynamic figures of the Kimberley to the X-ray art of Arnhem Land, and it changed and evolved across tens of thousands of years in ways that reflect the changing environments and cultural priorities of the communities that produced it. It is a living record of a civilization that has endured longer than any other. The continuity of Aboriginal Australian culture across 65,000 years is not simply an impressive statistic. It is evidence of a cognitive and social sophistication that sustained complex cultural transmission across an extraordinarily long time. The oral traditions, the ceremonial systems, the ecological knowledge, the cosmological frameworks, all of these were maintained not by writing, not by fixed external records, but by the social and cognitive technologies of memory, ceremony and transmission that Aboriginal communities developed and refined across the full span of their time in Australia. This is behavioural modernity in the most demanding sense, not just the ability to make complex tools or produce symbolic art, but the ability to maintain a coherent cultural tradition across tens of thousands of years without the technological crutch of writing. The depth of the oral tradition preserved by Aboriginal Australian communities across this span is, from a scientific perspective, one of the most remarkable features of their cultural achievement. The tradition of encoding environmental and geographical information in narrative and song, the song lines that map the continent in narrative terms, connecting sacred sites across vast distances through the language of story and ceremony, is a form of cultural memory technology that achieved something extraordinary before writing was invented: the preservation of accurate geographical and historical information across timescales of thousands of years. The specific cases of geological events preserved in Aboriginal oral traditions have been studied by researchers, including Patrick Nunn at the University of the Sunshine Coast, whose work on sea level rise stories in Aboriginal traditions has produced some of the most striking evidence for the antiquity of Australian oral tradition. Nunn and his colleagues identified dozens of Aboriginal traditions from coastal communities around Australia that describe the flooding of land that is now underwater, land that the storytellers describe as ancestral country, coastal plains and rivers and hills that were once inhabited and are now beneath the sea. When the geographical features described in these traditions are compared to what is known about post-glacial sea level rise, the flooding of coastal areas as global temperatures rose and ice sheets melted over the period from approximately 20,000 to 7,000 years ago, the correspondence is striking. The traditions describe in accurate detail specific coastal geographies that have been underwater for at least 7,000 years. This means the traditions have been maintained in accurate form across a minimum of 7,000 years of oral transmission, and in some cases the traditions appear to describe features last above sea level considerably longer ago, suggesting even greater antiquity of accurate transmission. 7,000 years of accurate oral tradition is extraordinary by any standard. 10,000 years of accurate oral tradition is without parallel in any other human cultural record. The cognitive and social technology that makes this possible is not trivial. Maintaining accurate information across thousands of years of oral transmission requires strong cultural norms around the accuracy of transmission, social structures that reward accurate remembering and penalize distortion, repeated ceremonial contexts that provide opportunities for reinforcement and verification of transmitted knowledge, and the cognitive capacity for the kind of associative memory that links narrative to landscape. The songline tradition does exactly this. It links narrative to geography in a way that the landscape itself serves as the memory aid, so that travelling through country is simultaneously travelling through story, and the story is a record encoded in the land itself. This is behavioural modernity in the most demanding and most consequential form it can take. Not symbolic art, not composite tools, not personal ornaments. Those are the visible signs of behavioural modernity that archaeologists look for in the ground. The deep behavioural modernity of the Aboriginal Australian tradition is something harder to see and harder to measure, but far more impressive in its implications. The capacity to build and maintain, through purely social and cognitive means, a cultural tradition that preserves accurate historical and geographical information across timescales that dwarf the entire span of recorded human civilization. The people who crossed the ocean 65,000 years ago built something that has outlasted everything their contemporaries in Africa and Asia built. It is still alive. If the crossing happened, and the genetic and archaeological evidence is overwhelming that it did, there should be evidence along the crossing route of the people who made it. Camps and stone tools and fire hearths on the islands of Wallacea, through which the crossing route passed. This evidence exists, and it is beginning to be studied systematically, though the field of Wallacean archaeology is still relatively young, and much remains to be discovered. The island of Flores in eastern Indonesia has produced one of the most significant archaeological sites along the crossing route, the Liangbua Cave, which is the discovery site of Homo floresiensis, the diminutive hominin popularly known as the Hobbit. Floresiensis presents its own remarkable story. A small-bodied hominin that survived on Flores until approximately 50,000 years ago, likely descended from Homo erectus populations that reached the island at least 1 million years ago and evolved in isolation toward reduced body size. What is relevant to the Australian crossing story is what the Floresiensis evidence implies about the deep history of sea crossings in the Wallacean region. Flores is separated from the Asian mainland by a water gap that was never bridged by dry land. Even at the lower sea levels of the Pleistocene, reaching Flores required a sea crossing. Homo erectus crossed that gap at least 1 million years ago, implying that archaic hominins were making sea crossings in Wallacea long before modern humans arrived. If archaic Homo erectus was capable of sea crossing sufficient to reach Flores 1 million years ago, the argument that modern humans with fully modern cognitive capabilities could not have crossed to Sahul 65,000 years ago becomes considerably harder to sustain. The question is not whether the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians had the capability for open water crossing. Something as cognitively limited as Homo erectus apparently had that capability. The question is whether they had the capability for the specific scale of crossing that Sahul required, significantly longer and more demanding than the crossings that brought erectus to Flores. The answer, given that they are known to have arrived, is yes. But the Flores evidence grounds the discussion in the empirical reality that sea crossing in this region has a history going back far longer than the modern human arrival. Other sites along the Wallacean crossing route are beginning to yield evidence of human occupation in the relevant period. The island of Timor, which may have been a key stepping stone on the crossing route to Sahul, has produced evidence of occupation by 44,000 years ago and possibly earlier. The island of Sulawesi, one of the largest islands in the Wallacean archipelago, has produced cave art dated to at least 45,000 years ago, making it among the oldest known cave art in the world, and archaeological evidence of occupation extending back potentially further. Each new site along the crossing route adds to the picture of a human population that was actively engaged with the maritime environment of Wallacea in the relevant period, building the experience and accumulated knowledge that the Sahul crossing required. The specific question of when people arrived in Australia has generated one of the most active and sometimes contentious debates in quaternary science, and understanding the nature of the debate is important for understanding how confident we should be in the 65,000-year figure and what it would take to change our assessment. The debate is not about whether people arrived before 50,000 years ago. That question is essentially settled, in the view of most researchers in the field, by the convergence of genetic evidence and archaeological evidence at multiple sites. The debate is about whether the arrival was at approximately 50,000 years ago, at the lower end of the dating ranges, or substantially earlier, at 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, as the genetic evidence and the Madjedbebe dates suggest. The stakes of this debate are significant for the behavioural modernity question. An arrival at 50,000 years ago is consistent with, or at least not strongly in tension with, the conventional Upper Paleolithic revolution model. It places the Australian colonisers at the outer edge of the behavioural modernity threshold rather than clearly before it. An arrival at 65,000 years ago places the crossing clearly and unambiguously before the conventional behavioural modernity threshold, requiring either a revision of that threshold or an explanation of how pre-behaviourally modern humans accomplished a feat that the model says they should not have been capable of. The specific methodological issues in dispute centre on the reliability of optically stimulated luminescence dating in the specific sedimentary conditions of Australian rock shelters, where bioturbation by burrowing animals can mix sediment layers and contaminate dating samples. OSL dating measures the last time mineral grains were exposed to light, and if older grains have been mixed into younger layers by bioturbation, the OSL dates for those layers will be older than the actual age of the human occupation they are associated with. This is the technical basis for the critique of the Madjedbebe dates, and it is a legitimate methodological concern that the original research team has addressed, but not definitively resolved to the satisfaction of all critics. The genetic evidence is not subject to the same bioturbation critique, since it is derived from contemporary genomes rather than from sedimentary deposits. The convergence of the genetic estimate and the Madjedbebe OSL dates at approximately 65,000 years is therefore significant. It is harder to dismiss a dating estimate that is supported by two independent lines of evidence from entirely different methodological frameworks than it is to dismiss one that rests on a single methodology. The convergence of genetics and archaeology at this date is the strongest argument for taking the 65,000-year figure seriously, despite the methodological questions about the OSL dates specifically. After everything the evidence tells us about the Australian crossing, it is worth being clear about what we actually know and where the genuine uncertainty lies. What we know with high confidence: human beings arrived in Sahul, the landmass that includes modern Australia and New Guinea, before 50,000 years ago. The genetic evidence for this is robust and has been replicated by multiple independent research teams using different methodologies. The arrival required a crossing of at least 90 kilometres of open ocean that was never bridged by dry land. The founding population was substantial, at minimum several hundred individuals, possibly more. The people who made the crossing were anatomically modern Homo sapiens, carrying fully modern cognitive capabilities. Their descendants have lived in Australia continuously for the entire subsequent period, maintaining a cultural tradition that is the oldest continuous cultural tradition in the world. What we know with moderate confidence, the arrival probably occurred at approximately 65,000 years ago, based on the convergence of genetic dating and the Madjedbebe OSL dates. The crossing route almost certainly passed through the Wollaston archipelago, with multiple island-to-island crossings required, the longest of which was at least 90 kilometres. The founders had encountered Denisovan somewhere along the route, and carried a significant Denisovan genetic contribution. The early Australians had sophisticated technological capabilities, including ground-edge axes and ochre processing equipment. What remains genuinely uncertain: the specific technology used for the crossing, whether rafts, boats, or some other form of watercraft, the specific navigation methods used, whether the crossing was intentional or accidental, or some combination of the two, whether the 65,000-year date or something earlier or later more accurately represents the first arrival, how quickly the founding population dispersed across the continent, and what the early demographic history looked like. What is not uncertain is the fundamental fact that defines this story. People crossed open ocean to reach Australia at a time when, by our best models of what was humanly possible at that moment, the crossing should not yet have been achievable. They did it anyway. Whatever the specific date, whether 55,000 or 65,000 or 75,000 years ago, the crossing represents a behavioural and cognitive achievement that challenges our understanding of what early modern humans were capable of and when they were capable of it. There is a specific object that, if found, would transform everything we think we know about the Australian crossing and about the cognitive capabilities of the humans who made it. It is an object that almost certainly does not survive anywhere in the archaeological record. But the search for it, and the broader project of underwater archaeology in the Wollaston region, is one of the most important frontiers in the study of human prehistory, and it is worth spending time with what that search might eventually find and what it would mean if it did. The object is a boat, or a raft, or any physical remnant of the watercraft that carried the first Australians across the Timor Sea 65,000 years ago. A single preserved plank, a lashing of plant fibre preserved in an anaerobic deposit, a clay impression of a hull in a rapidly sealed sedimentary layer. Any of these would be the most significant archaeological find in the history of the discipline. Not because it would tell us something we do not already know, we already know the crossing happened, but because it would tell us something we cannot currently know, what the technology looked like, what the crossing actually required in physical, material terms, and by implication, what the people who built it were actually capable of. The probability of finding preserved watercraft from 65,000 years ago is extremely low. Wood, bamboo, plant fibre, and every other organic material that a vessel of that period would have been made from decays rapidly in the tropical environments through which the crossing route passed. Even in the most favourable preservation conditions, cold, dry, and noxic, organic materials rarely survive more than a few tens of thousands of years. 65,000 years of tropical heat and humidity is an almost insuperable preservation challenge. But the search for evidence of the crossing is not limited to looking for the boats themselves. The coastal and underwater archaeology of the Wallacean region offers a different kind of hope. The hope of finding the campsites, the preparation sites, the waypoints along the crossing route where the crossing group stopped to rest, to provision, and to prepare for the next leg of the journey. Many of these sites would have been on coastlines that were occupied when sea levels were 60 to 100 metres lower than today, and that are now submerged beneath the shallow seas of the Indonesian archipelago. Finding them requires underwater archaeology, the systematic survey and excavation of submerged landscapes in the coastal waters of Indonesia, Timor, and the adjacent islands. Underwater archaeology in this region is in its infancy. The shallow seas of the Wallacean archipelago have not been systematically surveyed for archaeological sites, partly because the technical challenges are significant. Visibility in shallow tropical waters is often poor, biological growth on submerged surfaces is rapid, and the logistical and financial requirements for systematic underwater survey are substantially greater than for terrestrial excavation. But the technology is improving. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam bathymetry, and underwater ROV systems are making it increasingly possible to survey large areas of seabed efficiently and to identify features that might represent archaeological deposits. What underwater survey in the Wallacean region might find, if the sites exist and are identifiable, is evidence of human occupation on the now submerged coastal landscapes of the crossing route. Stone tool scatters on what were once beaches, hearth features in sediment deposits, shell middens from coastal foraging, and possibly the preserved organic remains of structures or vessels in anaerobic mud deposits where oxygen exclusion has prevented decay. Any of these finds would not only provide direct evidence of the crossing groups and their technology, but would also tell us about the ecology and subsistence of the maritime people who made the crossing, what they were eating, how they were living, what resources the coastal environments of Wallacea provided to the people who were working towards Sahul. The submerged landscape archaeology of the Australian continental shelf offers a parallel opportunity. The Sahul shelf, the shallow seas around northern Australia that were dry land during the glacial maximum, contains the remains of the landscapes that the first Australians inhabited in the period immediately after their arrival. The rivers, lakes, and coastal environments of glacial age northern Australia, now submerged under 10 to 100 metres of water, would have been the earliest Australian landscapes, the places where the founding population first set foot on their new continent, first explored, first established camps and subsistence patterns. Finding archaeological sites in these submerged landscapes would give us a picture of the arrival that terrestrial archaeology cannot provide. The Western Australian Museum has been conducting systematic survey of the submerged Sahul shelf in collaboration with traditional owner communities, using multi-beam sonar and sediment coring to identify promising archaeological targets, and in some cases recovering artefacts from submerged deposits. The results so far are preliminary but encouraging. Sedimentary sequences that appear to preserve organic material from the relevant period have been identified, and the recovery of stone artifacts from submerged contexts is technically feasible. The field is moving fast. What would it mean, in broader terms, if the underwater archaeology of the Wollaston region and the Australian shelf eventually produced direct evidence of the crossing and its immediate aftermath. It would mean, most concretely, that we finally had physical evidence of the technology that humanity's most audacious prehistoric journey required. It would allow archaeologists to move beyond inference and into description, to say not just that the crossing happened, and therefore some form of watercraft must have existed, but to describe what that watercraft looked like and what level of technological sophistication it represents. More broadly, such a discovery would anchor the behavioural modernity debate in a way that the current evidence, powerful as it is, cannot quite achieve. The genetic evidence tells us the crossing happened. The Madjedbebe dates tell us when. But neither of these lines of evidence is fully satisfying to the human desire to understand how, to see, in physical and material terms, the actual thing that the actual people made and used. The boats are the missing piece, the object that would make the crossing real in the way that artifacts make the past real, not a statistical inference or a DNA date, but a thing, physical and present, that you can look at and understand. The people who made the crossing did not leave their boats for us to find. They used them, wore them out, beached them and salvaged the materials for other purposes, or left them to the tropical sea that would have dismantled them in a few seasons of sun and salt water. They were practical people solving a practical problem, not preservers of heritage for future archaeologists. The boats are gone, but the search for what they left behind, the campsites, the tool scatters, the cooking fires on what were once beaches, is ongoing, and the technology to conduct that search effectively is improving year by year. 65,000 years after the crossing, we are beginning to have the tools to look for its traces. We are beginning to look in the right places. The story of the Australian crossing is not finished. It is, in an important sense, just beginning to be told. 65,000 years ago, or thereabouts, give or take the uncertainty of our best dating methods, a group of human beings looked across a horizon of open ocean and went toward it. They had no map. They had no compass. They could not see what was on the other side, and they may not have known anything was on the other side. They went anyway. We do not know their names. We do not know what they called themselves or their vessels or the ocean they crossed. We do not know whether they crossed in fear or in hope, whether the crossing was deliberate or accidental, whether the first person to see the coast of Sahul on the horizon felt relief or wonder or the specific feeling that has no name, the feeling of being the first. What we know is the outcome. They arrived. They survived. They built a civilization, not in the narrow sense of cities and writing and states, but in the broader and more fundamental sense of a coherent way of living in relationship with a specific place and a specific world, transmitted across generations by the social and cognitive technologies of oral tradition and ceremony and ecological knowledge. They built that civilization and they maintained it in that specific place for 65,000 years. And when European ships arrived on the same coast 12 generations ago, the descendants of those first crossers were still there, still carrying the traditions and the knowledge and the languages that descended in unbroken line from the people who first stepped onto that beach. The ocean crossing that happened 50,000 years too early was not an anomaly in the history of human capability. It was evidence that the standard model was wrong, that human beings were already doing extraordinary things long before the archaeology gave us the resolution to see it clearly. The people were there. The genes are the proof. The crossing happened. Whatever brought them across that ocean, hunger, curiosity, accident, the horizon's particular pull on the human imagination, the result was one of the most consequential journeys in the history of life on Earth. A new world found, a new civilization begun. 65,000 years of unbroken human presence in a place that no human had ever been. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. And if you are from Australia, or from Papua New Guinea, or from any of the communities whose ancestors made that crossing, I want you to know that the science is catching up to what your traditions have always known. The people were there first, and they have been there ever since. Subscribe if the deep history, the parts that don't fit the textbooks, the parts that keep surprising the scientists, is what brings you here. Good night.